left off. Throughout a life spent at the intersection of scholarship and public service, I have been painfully aware that superstitions and quaint notions of biological and even moral differences between blacks and whites continue to affect race relations in the United States even into the 21st century. In 1943, Gunnar Mitchell called attention to these discussions and debates over racial differences in his classic American Dilemma. And when the Committee of the Status of Black Americans, of which I was a member, took another look in 1989, while updating Mitchell's book, we saw much of the same thing and set forth these and other views in a common destiny. Blacks in American society. In our discussion of the race and the problem, we declared that it could well create new fissures that might in turn lead to an increased level of confrontations and violence. The Rodney King riots of 1991 offered vivid testimony that there still persists much too much potential for racial conflict for anyone to be complacent. Of the many recollections I have arising from my 15 months as chair of President Clinton's advisory board on race is that of the black woman who screamed during a meeting her history of how she had been abused and mistreated because of her race. My memory of the white man who claimed that already too much was being done for African Americans and it was he who needed protection from policies such as affirmative action is no less vivid. The advisory board was troubled by these and similar competing claims, and it became clear that the open dialogues and, if necessary, limitless discussions were the civilized approach to finding constructive ways of dealing with America's racial ills. It did and will require not only persistent diligence, but also abiding patience. During my life, it has been necessary to work not only as hard as my energies would permit, but do it as regularly and as consistently as humanly possible. This involves the strictest discipline and the maximum use of my time and energy. I worked 2 jobs in college and graduated school that made inordinate demands on my time, but there was no alternative to the regimen that circumstances demanded. And those circumstances included a refusal to check my Catholic interests that have always prompted me to participate in activities beyond scholarship. Balancing professional and personal activities has resulted in a life full of rich rewards, in consequence deeply indebted to my near 60-year marriage to Aurelia Whittington. My father called her the trooper for her patient, good-willed, indomitable spirit. She was that and so much more. How do I calculate the influence of having spent 2/3 of my life living alongside an exemplar of selfless dignity? Even before we were married, I learned so much from Aurelia. She taught me to put others ahead of my own preference, as she did routinely. There is no more vivid example of her habit of self-sacrifice than when she abandoned her own career. She did so in order to be there for Whit, our only child, when our adult Brooklyn neighbors taunted him and sought in every way possible to convey that neither he nor his family was welcome to live in their previously all-white neighborhood. My life has been dedicated to and publicly defined by scholarship, a lifelong affection for the profession of history and the myriad institutions that support it. A white professor at a historically black Fisk University powerfully influenced my choice of a career. One I decided early on to dedicate to new areas of study wherever possible in order to maintain a lively, fresh approach to teaching and writing history. This is how I happened to get into African American history, in which I never had a formal course, but that attracted an increasing number of students of my generation and many more in later generations. But I was determined that I would not be confined to a box of any kind, so I regarded African American history as not so much as a separate field and as a subspecialty. I'm going to read that again. But I was determined that I would not be confined to a box of any kind. So I regarded African American history as not so much a separate field as a subspecialty of American history. Even in graduate school, I was interested in women's history, and in more recent years, I have studied and written papers in that field, although I never claimed more than the desire to examine it intensely rather than presume to master it entirely. I could not work in the field of history without maintaining some contact with other historians and some affiliation with historical associations. Consequently, at the Library of Congress and in local libraries where I was engaged in research, I made a point of meeting other historians and discussing with them matters of mutual interest. I not only maintained an active membership in the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, but joined other groups even where it became necessary to educate members to the extent possible that history knows no bounds, either the human experience or in the rules governing who is eligible to record it. This could not involve demeaning myself or in any way compromising my own self-respect. On occasion, it did involve venturing into groups and organizations when it was not clear if their reception of me would be cool or cordial. Nevertheless, as a consequence, I became active in the major national professional organizations long before most other African Americans joined them. In much the same way, I became involved with historical groups in other parts of the world. My ever-widening contacts in the United States presented me with opportunities to be associated with historians in Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and South America. Each contact was instructive not only about the many things that peoples of the world have in common, but also as to the intense interest other peoples have in problems and developments far removed from their own that will nevertheless assist them in understanding their own society. A remarkable and unforeseen result of my determination to pursue my profession wherever it led, be that into the halls of previously all-white academic associations or to the far-flung scholarly organizations scattered across the globe, were the contacts that released me from the straitjacket confinement of pursuing a career exclusively in historically black colleges and universities. My life and my career have been fulfilled not merely by my own efforts, but also by the thoughtful generosity of family, friends, and professional colleagues. I can only hope that they realize, as do I, how interdependent we all are and how much more rewarding and fulfilling life is whenever we reach a level of understanding where we can fully appreciate the extent of our interrelationships with and our reliance on those who came before us, kept us company during our lives, and will come after us. That ends chapter 1. As we enter chapter 2, titled The World of My Youth. The school board of Rentonville, Oklahoma met in mid-summer 1914 and after, in quote, due deliberation, voted to deny Molly Parker Franklin's request for a maternity leave for one school year. Such denials were not especially unusual in those days, considering the fact that most school boards preferred young, single women as teachers. But this denial was special and pointed. Both Molly and her husband, Buck Colbert Franklin, had incurred the wrath of Rentonville all-black, all-Baptist town fathers by revealing their commitment to Methodism shortly after their arrival from Ardmore, Oklahoma in 1912. The couple having attended and met at Roger Williams University, Nashville's Baptist Institution of Higher Learning for African Americans, it was assumed by the village leaders that they were, in quote, good Baptists. If there was any lingering doubt, it had been eliminated by the further local knowledge that after Molly returned Tennessee to teach. Buck, having no strong attachment to Roger Williams, followed Professor John Hope, who had moved to Atlanta Baptist College, which was later Morehouse College, in 1901. My parents had enjoyed a lengthy and deeply committed courtship based on common interest and constant association. Buck was from the Indian Territory, where his ancestors had fled with their Native American owners when Andrew Jackson expelled them from Alabama and Mississippi in the mid-1830s. In Molly, he found an ideal and attractive companion. They studied together, and she cheered him on as he drew admiration as a scholar gentleman and varsity center and captain of the Roger Williams football team. And while they briefly went their separate ways at the beginning of the new century, they never lost touch with each other. To bide her time until they could marry, my mother taught in Ged until her father, Harding Parker, died. She then secured employment as a teacher in Shelbyville, Bolivar County, Mississippi. Bolivar County, Mississippi. Meanwhile, my father returned to the Choctaw Nation in the Indian Territory to be near his father in his declining and final years. By 1903, Buck's parents had both died, and so had Molly's. They could finally make plans for their own future. Thus, Buck journeyed to Mount Bayou, where he and Molly were married on April 1st, 1903. They went almost immediately to Springer, Oklahoma, in the Indian Territory, where Buck taught, farmed, and at a time when most advocated little more than, in quote, industrial education for blacks, took correspondence courses in law and studied for the bar. Awaiting teaching opportunities, Molly became, for a time, a milliner as well as a seamstress. After they moved to Ardmore and after Buck passed the bar examination in 1908, she would pursue her trade alongside him in the same building. My father's practice grew, though not at a sufficient pace for him to cease looking for ways to supplement his income through writing, teaching, or journalism. Attracting clients was not easy. Few, besides African Americans, had any interest in engaging the services of a black lawyer, and many, black and white, were simply too poor to employ a lawyer of any kind. Regardless, those with economic resources viewed black lawyers with a wary eye, and for no other reason than they seriously doubted a black lawyer's chances in court of law where a white judge and a white jury held him in such low esteem. Buck learned this the hard way. In 1911, when a client's case pending in Shreveport, Louisiana, was called, Buck stood as a signal to the judge that he was present and ready to proceed. In disbelief, the presiding judge asked my father why he was standing. When Buck made the simple reply that he was representing his client in the case, the judge retorted that no, in quotes, nigger, represented anyone in his court. With that pronouncement, my father was ordered to vacate the courtroom. As he struggled against the odds during the next year or so, Buck kept his eyes open for a better opportunity. Soon, one appeared that seemed too good to be true. He heard of an all-black town, Ratonsville, in the northeastern part of Oklahoma, where people of his own color were in complete control of the schools, the judicial system, the post office, and all other public institutions and facilities. A score of such communities had arisen in the fledgling state, and many blacks sought refuge in them. Without any further investigation, my parents resolved to move as soon as possible. It could hardly be worse than their current situation, and so this adventuresome young couple with their two young children, Mozella and Buck Jr., cast their lot with Ratonsville. Finding a place that provided emotional security for themselves was one thing. Finding a way to make a living in a village of a few hundred people was quite another. The Franklins soon discovered that Ratonsville provided neither. Ratonsville was torn by factionalism. The rivalry of the two principal churches, one Baptist and another Methodist, was in part to blame. So too was the way the inhabitants sought to curry favor with the whites who lived in Oktaha, about 6 miles to the north, and Chekota, about 5 miles to the south. Buck Franklin soon referred to Resinsville as the, end quote, Negro quarters for the, end quote, big houses that were Oktaha and Chekota. Within those quarters, the Baptist pastor had assumed leadership of the entire community, including the school board and the town council. The Methodists were no match for him, and then Buck, the Baptist minister, thought that he had a valuable ally. He was soon bitterly disappointed. A lifelong Methodist, Buck was quickly identified as a leader in the enemy camp. Community-minded, the Franklins gave him cause. For though my parents were indeed Methodists by upbringing and inclination, their confrontation with Resinsville Baptist power brokers was not fundamentally theological. At its heart was my parents' resolve to pursue lives of dignified self-determination and to instill the same resolve in their children and their neighbors. Following the birth of my sister, my parents' third child, Anne Harriet, in 1913, Molly secured a position as a teacher in the local elementary school, but practiced law locally as well as in Ifula, the county seat. He began to edit a newspaper, the Retinsville News, and for a few months in 1914, he served as a justice of the peace. After waging a vigorous campaign through his congressmen and some influential white lawyers, he was appointed postmaster. Postal service was dispensed in the front room of my parents' house, and when my father was away on some legal matter or attempting his hand at farming, my mother looked after the post office. It was in the following year that Molly, once again pregnant, requested from the school board a leave of absence until after her child was born. The board, under the Baptist pastor's influence, refused and instead requested her resignation. The white superintendent of the county schools disallowed the action in order that a substitute be employed until my mother could return to work. Saturday, January 2nd, 1915, was not an especially eventful day in the world or indeed in Retinsville. The war in Europe droned on, with that day's New York Times announcing the sinking by the Germans of the British warship Formidable in the English Channel. It would be another 2 years before the United States was drawn into the conflict. Buck Franklin himself notes in his diary simply, end quote, the year 1915 was uneventful except for the same grinding poverty caused by the continuous warfare between the factions in Resinsville. This year's strain was aggravated by the birth of a child, John Hope. 40 years later, when I first read that entry, I realized here was poignant testimony of my family's circumstances from a man who never failed to make evident his love for and confidence in all his children. I have astoundingly clear recollections of my early childhood, including my almost fatal bout with Spanish influenza in the fall of 1918. I can remember all too well Dr. Lowe calling to see me and my mother sitting by my bed day and night until finally I recovered. And while it is not clear who looked after me during my first 2 or 3 years, my sister Mozella, 9 years my senior, boasted until her death in 1986 that she was my first babysitter. Given my mother's success in retaining her teaching job, I suspect that some neighbor had a hand in looking after me during those first months and years. By the time I was 3, however, my mother had charge of every aspect of my life. There were daycare centers anywhere. There were few daycare centers anywhere in 1918, and certainly Resinsville had none. Since the school board had lost its major fight regarding my mother's leave of absence when I was born, it left her to her own devices for the time being. Thus, it proved easiest for her to bring me to school with her. She placed me at a school desk, gave me a sheet of paper and a pencil, and admonished me to be quiet. I was enthralled with the classroom, the pictures of the wall, the blackboard, and the animated responses of my mother's first grade students. And there were letters and numbers that she wrote out in chalk. One day, As she visited the student's desk, she walked over to see what I was doing. She discovered that I had copied from the blackboard what she had written. I had, indeed, learned the alphabet and could write simple sentences. While my penmanship was poor, well before the age of 5, I could read and write. My early memories are not solely of the classroom. When I was 4, we moved from a small house on a road by the railroad to a larger house on the main road. Evidence that my parents' steadfast efforts to escape poverty were increasingly succeeding. Here, I had more playmates, and for Christmas, I got a tricycle on which I raced around outside. Though we had moved farther from it, we remained dependent on the railroad, specifically the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas line, which we called the Katy. 2 trains, one from the north and the other from the south, passed through in the early morning and again in the early evening. Except when they were flagged for oncoming passengers or when someone was on board who wanted to get off, they did not stop. The mailbag was placed on a specially constructed pole from which it was snatched by a hook on the passing train. When my father was postmaster, I enjoyed going down to the track and watching him suspend the outgoing mail and pick up the mailbag that was thrown from the fast-moving train. Besides the mail, the Katy brought news contained in the Daily Phoenix from Muskogee and the Black Dispatch from Oklahoma City. When it stopped to deliver them, the boxes and crates from the train invariably went to Brinson's store, a few yards up the main road from our house. When my parents purchased staples they had failed to buy in Chickasaw, and where I spent my pennies on confections. Brinson's store was a large one-room emporium that, to my youthful eye, contained just about everything that one would ever need or want. Around the big wood burning stove, customers and visitors gathered on winter days. The boxes displaying cookies and candies attracted me, but so too did the large wheel of cheese from which Mrs. Brinson cut thin slices that she served with crackers. Then there was the large barrel of pickles, a treat some children purchased for all-day suckers. Brinson's was more than adequate substitute for those of us unable to regularly go to Chickasaw. I'm going to read that last sentence again. Brinson's was a more than adequate substitute for those of us unable to go regularly to Chickasaw. And now that is the end of part 2 of this ASMR reading of Mirror to America, the autobiography of John Hope Franklin, the century fight for civil rights told in first person, singular, by a preeminent American historian.